Good morning and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and if you're new, then welcome. I'd love to earn your subscription today. Today we are going through Time's special edition that goes through the life, legacy, and the death, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. The reason we are doing this, and we did it last episode for Martin Luther King Jr., is because of the recent executive orders that have said that the documents for JFK's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, and Robert F. Kennedy's assassinations are going to be reviewed. Anything that has been classified to this point has been ordered to get onto a schedule to be released. And so in anticipation of that, I wanted to go through these magazines with you. So we already did the one for Martin Luther King Jr. Now you might be wondering about JFK. If you're new to the channel, we have an entire playlist about the JFK assassination. So there are tons of videos on that topic. I welcome you to go and just watch to your heart's content, because we have gone through main players in the assassination. We have gone through a day-by-day account of the assassination, and there will be more to come. But these two assassinations of Martin Luther King in our last episode and then Robert F. Kennedy, these two assassinations are less well known. And so I thought it would be good to get a sense of each man, their legacy, refresh ourselves on the circumstances around the final years or events of their lives and their assassinations. So let's get into Robert F. Kennedy, his life and legacy. The entrance to this magazine takes us right to the final year of his life, which was a presidential campaign. Now, prior to this point, of course, he had been the Attorney General for his brother, John F. Kennedy. He had taken time and run for the Senate. And then in 1968, he was running to become the nominee for the Democrat Party. A life cut short. Robert F. Kennedy, 1925 to 1968. So, like his brother, but even with less years than his brother, he was a young man affecting American politics. It says he was a man of seeming contradictions. Born to great wealth, Bobby Kennedy made common cause with the least fortunate. Initially viewed as ruthless, over time he became deeply concerned with the plight of others, and he struggled to find realistic political solutions to their problems. He loved a crusade, and in his early years in public life, he opposed communism, corrupt labor union leaders, and organized crime. Later, he found larger, more complex targets to address: racism, poverty, institutional indifference. Most importantly, he challenged all of us to join him, not simply in imagining a better world for all, but in doing the difficult, everyday work of making those visions reality. If you are not familiar, we are given this photo of the Kennedy children that help us put Robert in the proper order. So this photo right here is Joseph Kennedy, the father. He was the patriarch of the family, and his role in government had been being Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ambassador to England. He had done other things in the financial world as well, but in this photo, you can see Joe Jr., the oldest brother, that unfortunately was killed during World War II in a plane accident. Then we have our president, John F. Kennedy. And then this is Robert F. Kennedy. So this can give you a sense of the years difference between them. I believe he was 8 years younger. Then we are given this look at RFK with Ethel, his bride. This is Bobby and Ethel romping with their children in 1957. They did reportedly have a very lively home. Of course, this is Bobby and Jack. Bobby was the Attorney General to JFK. And the two brothers, there are many books and movies written about it, but of course, they moved together through many political battles. And JFK pulled in his brother. He's one of the only political people to have brought in family members to that degree of position. But JFK's doing so was because he knew he could trust his brother, and he had big political fights to take on, like with organized crime. Here we have 1966, so this was 2 years before his death. Bobby met with local citizens in Greenville, Mississippi. The senator's empathy for the least fortunate seemed to take deeper root after he weathered his brother's assassination in 1963. In Philadelphia in 1968, receiving a hero's welcome. One of the interesting things about the Kennedy brothers is that, of course, they were given this sort of reception, including Ted, who went on to serve longer than either of his two brothers had, but who perhaps was the least, who was the least honorable Kennedy. But because of the assassination, RFK and Ted enjoyed this dear place in people's hearts where they wanted to welcome them and wanted them to have the mantle of their fallen brother. As RFK's coffin was going down the track, these are a variety of people who stood to mourn him in his passing. There was a funeral train. Of course, he was killed in California the night of the primary, where he had won the California primary for presidency. Prior to that point, it was looking like maybe he will, maybe he won't. But that was the first night of genuine hope that he could lock in the Democrat nomination. Here are some things that were memorable quotes from RFK. Some see things as they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not. Kennedy took this phrase from George Bernard Shaw and frequently used it to end his speeches. These are thoughts that, these three that I'm about to read are thoughts that he gave in response on the day after the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered. No martyr's cause has ever been stilled by an assassin's bullet. Another that he said was, "For there is another kind of violence, slower, but just as deadly, destructive as the shot or the bomb in the night. This is the violence of institutions, indifference and inaction and slow decay." And then he said, "We must admit in ourselves that our own children's futures cannot be built on the misfortunes of others. We must recognize that this short life can neither be ennobled or enriched by hatred or revenge." One thing that was interesting to me, and I would point you to it, the link will be in the show notes, is that Jackie Kennedy, Coretta Scott King, and Ethel Kennedy had a special friendship that began, of course, Ethel and Jackie were sisters-in-law, but it began when JFK was assassinated. And then as the other two women, Jackie and Ethel, came around Coretta Scott King and her grief. And then as those other two women, Jackie and Coretta Scott King, came and surrounded Ethel in her grief when her husband was assassinated. Here we have the family photo of the Kennedys. We have Joe Sr. with JFK, or John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And then this is Patricia, Eunice, and Jean. Jean was the youngest sister between RFK and Ted. She was actually there the night of his assassination, so we'll see her again in a moment, I bet. Here is Robert F. Kennedy, the one about whom this magazine is written. This is Rosemary Kennedy. She, if you don't know, had developmental problems from birth and was basically, her life was more or less snuffed out by a lobotomy, and she was institutionalized for the remainder of her life. This is Kick Kennedy. Her name was Kathleen, but they called her Kick. She would die in a plane crash before JFK's presidency, long before JFK's presidency. This is Joe Jr., who again died in World War II. And then this is Ted Kennedy, the future senator. This is the mother, Rose. So that is the Kennedy family. It says a hard-driving Irish-American tycoon raised his 9 children on the greatest of expectations to lead the nation. Robert F. Kennedy liked to tell friends and journalists, "I was the 7th of 9 children. And when you come from that far down, you have to struggle to survive." Any young child of a large family could sympathize with this man who reached among the highest rungs in American politics, yet even as an adult was called by his childhood nickname, Bobby. But his rueful observation takes on extra meaning considering the family he grew up in, the vastly wealthy, supremely ambitious, strenuously active, profoundly Irish Catholic, and ultimately legendary brood, sired by Joseph P. Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. Perhaps the most significant thing to understand about Joe Kennedy's role in his sons' political careers is that he himself desired the presidency. However, his view on World War II ultimately cost him that opportunity. He took the view of the isolationist perspective, meaning that we should just stay out of World War II and let Europe fight their own wars and don't worry about Hitler. Kennedy wasn't alone in his stance, we're told. Many Americans called themselves isolationists. However, Roosevelt recognized Hitler's ambitions and regarded him as a threat to the entire globe, which of course turned out to be the right view. Staking his flag on the wrong side of history, Joe Kennedy then isolated himself as Hitler rampaged through Europe. And so even while he pursued his actions as an ambassador to Britain, his own political star fell. And so he was never able to recover his own political reputation, but he began working at that point to advance his children's political opportunities. And Joe Sr. wished for Joe Jr. to be that political star, but of course he lost his life. So then JFK knew that he was carrying the ambitions of his father, and thus when Robert F. Kennedy watched his brother's life be snuffed out, he knew the mantle had passed to him. Bobby's character was shaped by his size. Joe Sr. called him the runt of the family litter. He was the smallest and the least athletic of Joe's 4 sons. Joe Jr. and Ted grew up to be strapping men, both over 6 feet tall. John was less athletic, but he stood 6'2". Robert was a full size shorter at 5'10". As a boy, his posture was slumped, his eyes were downcast, and he peered out and up at the world through a thatch of unruly hair. In the arena, we're given the years of 1943 to 1956, where Bobby entered into his brother's political actions. In 1943, RFK entered Harvard as a freshman, following the precise footsteps of his father and 2 older brothers. The war ended in August 1945, and it wasn't until February 1946 that Bobby went to sea, not as an officer, but with the rank of Seaman Second Class, posted by Navy chiefs to a new destroyer that had just been named for his brother, the USS Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. The ship's shakedown cruise to test the ship was in the Caribbean, and Bobby was aboard. That would be so meaningful, wouldn't it, to be riding in the opening sail of a ship, a destroyer, named after your biggest brother. You can see the weight of the mantle settling onto him, even in things like that you would literally be carrying the name of your brother in your very first voyage at sea as well. Well, as Jack advanced politically, Bobby went with him. He was a highly effective campaign executive. He served as a buffer between Jack and his father. His father was known as a hothead, and so he provided that buffer. Here is a photo of his wedding to Ethel. It says Bobby married Ethel Skakel in 1950, and she was his perfect partner, energetic and impish, yet still thoughtful and loving. We are given some of the political machinations that happened with JFK's early career that Bobby participated in, but it is a section that's focused on JFK's career, and therefore I am going to keep moving so that we can focus in on RFK. So, of course, the presidential race in 1960 brought JFK to the front, but RFK came along with him. He worked the floor artfully at the Democratic National Convention in 1960, and here it says, in public, LBJ and the Kennedy brothers were allies. You can see the photo here of LBJ riotously laughing. RFK is there in the fold, and then JFK is speaking. But in private, LBJ and RFK were enemies. As JFK and RFK told the story later, JFK ultimately decided to offer the vice presidential nomination to LBJ as a pro forma offer based on LBJ's second place finish and his support from so many in the party. The idea was to flatter the outsized Texan, and the brothers assumed he would not be interested in leaving the Senate because he exerted a mastery and a command seldom matched in congressional history. The offer would also flatter Texans and voters across the South, but they didn't think he would take it. The morning after JFK won the nomination, he visited LBJ's hotel room and offered him the place on the ticket. To Kennedy's deep dismay, Johnson accepted the offer. When JFK told his campaign manager of this development, Bobby pitched a classic fit. As he later told the story, he then visited Johnson in his room and tried to sound him out about rejecting the offer. But LBJ insisted he wanted the position and thought he could help the campaign in the South. The die was cast. Bobby reportedly later said that the night JFK won the nomination was the best day of his life, and that the next day when LBJ signed on to the campaign was the worst. The poisonous relationship between Bobby Kennedy and LBJ would be one of the major factors in RFK's life until it was ended so abruptly in 1968. Here we have RFK and Ethel there behind Jack. It says they're watching the returns of the 1960 presidential election in RFK's Cape Cod home. Then we're given a look at Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General. Of course, that was his role during the JFK presidency. After John F. Kennedy won a narrow victory over Richard Nixon in 1960, one of his first tasks was to assemble a cabinet that would deliver on the promise of new frontiers for America. One key cabinet post was settled early. Joe Kennedy wanted his son Bobby to be JFK's Attorney General, and after some resistance, Jack agreed. Both brothers knew the decision would be highly controversial. It smelled of nepotism, and it threatened to burn up the goodwill of the new president's honeymoon period. Bobby Kennedy would be only barely 35 when he assumed office. His law school record was undistinguished, and he had never tried a case in a courtroom. Moreover, he was widely regarded as a hothead and a ruthless political operator, the bad cop to JFK's good cop. The first person who needed persuading was Bobby himself, but his role in the Kennedy clan had been brought into sharp focus by now. He was the consigliere to his older brother. Jack Kennedy needed a counselor who grasped all the challenges he faced, a fixer who could tackle problems both political and personal, and keep quiet about it, a sounding board who wasn't afraid to criticize him, and an ally whose loyalty was unquestioned. In short, Jack Kennedy needed his younger brother by his side. Jack made those arguments to Bobby over bacon and eggs at his Georgetown townhouse shortly after the election, and although Bobby expressed caution, his destiny was clear. The patriarch wanted it, the new president wanted it, ergo, Bobby should want it. It did receive a lot of criticism for him to be so, and under his leadership as Attorney General, we're told that the Justice Department became more informal than ever before, yet harder working, more risk-inclined, and more effective at the same time. Kennedy's roomy offices were cauldrons of activity, and the department's pace began to reflect his urgency. The lights stayed on, formality was dispensed with, stodgy bureaucrats were sidelined, and a cadre of idealistic young staffers fresh from the Ivy League prowled the halls, their shirt sleeves rolled up in emulation of the new, young Attorney General. The door to RFK's office was often open, and the staff felt free to drop in. The walls of his office were covered with his children's colorful drawings. The new Attorney General wandered the halls of the Justice Department, and for many staffers, it was the first time they had ever met one of the agency's leaders. His Justice Department and his brother's White House hewed to the same operating principles that Joseph P. Kennedy's business affairs had. Operate in secrecy. Don't write anything down, Joe always said. Use back channels and personal connections when possible. Avoid excess public scrutiny in crafting policy. The results were in many cases effective, yet sometimes detrimental to the brothers and to the nation. Bobby certainly needed his father's wiles to confront one of his largest problems. Within the Justice Department, technically reporting to the new Attorney General, was a 66-year-old figure who had occupied his position for 37 years, J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Hoover used the investigators at his command to compile incriminating dossiers on every major player in the Capitol. We talked about this in the Martin Luther King episode, that they did this for Martin Luther King Jr. He knew everyone's secrets, and he artfully leveraged that knowledge to enhance his own power. His say-so was law, even in the most insignificant realms, including what sort of television set the Attorney General would be granted in his own office at the Justice Department. Why would Hoover have control over that? Kennedy and Hoover had one thing in common. They hated each other. The slight, rumpled, brash, youthful Attorney General and the glowering FBI autocrat, a closeted homosexual, were destined to be adversaries. If Kennedy had bright, energetic young aides on his side, Hoover had dark secrets in his dossiers. Within weeks of JFK's inauguration, Hoover began sending memos to RFK detailing FBI evidence of his older brother's secret extramarital liaisons with a number of women. Thus, Bobby's role as keeper of his brother's secrets made both men vulnerable to Hoover's blackmail. Bobby regarded Hoover as a malign force, but in his eagerness to root out corruption in labor unions and battle organized crime, he signed off on FBI requests for hundreds of wiretaps that were illegal, and whose incriminating findings, obtained through deception, could not be used in a court of law. Kennedy's acquiescence to Hoover's tactics is regarded as indefensible by most historians. Well, that's interesting. I have read that RFK was partly hated by organized crime because he dared to go after them. That his father, Joe Kennedy, had enjoyed sort of a, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours relationship with the mob, and that the mob, anticipated that that sort of relationship would continue with the two brothers, and that they were furious when that arrangement did not continue under JFK's presidency. But this is telling us that actually there were things where RFK used the Justice Department in an unethical way for these wiretaps and that sort of thing. At home, RFK was forced to confront. So we're told about the 13 days and Bay of Pigs and, Cold War, CIA, Cuba issues that were at the forefront during the Kennedy administration. But then it goes on. At home, RFK was forced to confront another issue he had initially hoped to avoid: racial segregation in the South. If at first he was annoyed by this generation of activists, he soon came to admire them deeply and became a forceful ally. Even so, in October 1963, the month before his brother would be assassinated, RFK secretly signed off on FBI wiretaps of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., as was first confirmed in U.S. Senate hearings in 1975. Former RFK aide Katzenbach has argued that Kennedy agreed to this illegal activity to disprove FBI theories that King had communist associates, which it did disprove. but RFK's consent to those taps is widely regarded as a blemish on his record of public service. That is interesting. I did not realize that he had been part of that. Now, he was regarded as a civil rights activist, that in the battle for equality, the Attorney General was acting as a point man. This article chronicles the civil rights movement and various events in it, but where it lands is that President Kennedy had addressed the nation about the subject of civil rights, but was assassinated before the Civil Rights Bill would be ready to be submitted. His successor, LBJ, did sign the most important civil rights bills in U.S. history, but we're told credit for their passage also goes to Bobby Kennedy, who ended up spending countless sleepless nights moving the nation to confront the curse of racism. There's a whole article that we will not read about Bobby's role as an advisor during the nuclear showdown. But then we are given a look at his role comforting Jackie after his brother's assassination. On Friday afternoon, November 22nd, 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy was eating a tuna fish sandwich by the swimming pool at his home, Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia, joined by his wife Ethel and 2 Justice Department officials, when a nearby workman painting an addition to the house began running at them, clutching a transistor radio in his hand. Just then, the poolside telephone rang. The caller was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had a short, curt message for Bobby. "I have news for you. The president's been shot." When Bobby asked if the wound was serious, Hoover said he believed it was. Then he hung up. Hoover was a real jerk. Bobby turned to the others and said, "Jack's been shot. It may be fatal." Of course, the president had been struck while riding in a motorcade in Dallas and was declared dead at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. The odd thing about it, of course, is that RFK was his attorney general. So he, at least initially, was involved in some of those early conversations about LBJ becoming president, how you administer the oath of office, all sorts of, policy and administrative questions in the early moments of learning about his brother's death. It gives me a great deal of compassion for Robert F. Kennedy, that those were the things that he had to grapple with and at least provide a reasonable answer to in the middle of such grief. In the bitter hours that followed Jack's death, Robert stayed by Jackie's side. When Jackie arrived at Bethesda, when Air Force One arrived, Bobby got onto the airplane and reportedly brushed past Johnson without greeting them or making eye contact. "Where's Jackie?" is all he wanted to know. He found her in her blood-spattered pink suit, embraced her, and stayed by her side, along with the casket, riding with it all the way toward where it would be. The rivalry between RFK and LBJ deepened after the assassination, and there are reports that RFK suspected that LBJ may have done it. I do know that one of the earliest questions that RFK asked was whether or not any of our agencies had been involved, and I also happen to know that RFK met with, while he was still Attorney General for LBJ, he met with a man named Penn Jones, who compiled research that there were conspiracy elements involved and that it was far from true that Oswald was some sort of lone gunman. What RFK actually believed about the assassination is not fully clear to me, and is not presented here, but certainly there was no love lost between these two. Grief-stricken after Jack's death, Bobby Kennedy ran for office for the first time and was elected to represent New York in the U.S. Senate. When John F. Kennedy was slain, something inside Bobby Kennedy died as well. As Bobby told a reporter after Jack's death, he had to find a goal for the first time in his life because for as long as he could remember, he had no goal that was not his brother's. It's very interesting. Now a crusader without a crusade, at age 38, he was for the first time challenged with shaping his own life story. John F. Kennedy had picked up the mantle of Joe Jr. after the pilot's death in World War II. Would Bobby, in his turn, pick up the mantle of JFK? In 1964, Bobby realized he was ready to resign as Attorney General and find a new role in public life. He announced he would be running for the U.S. Senate representing New York. After some early fumbles, Bobby began to hit his stride. The adulation of the public helped. He drew huge crowds across the state of New York. Once his brother's keeper, he had now become his brother's replacement. RFK beat Keating by more than 719,000 votes, and Bobby Kennedy, tempered by grief and learning on the fly, had won his first election. We get a little look at RFK's family life. One thing that is unique about Robert F. Kennedy is that he was the father of 11 children, the 11th of whom was born after his passing. Ethel was relatively newly pregnant when RFK was assassinated. And so he was the father of 11. They had a boisterous clan of devout Roman Catholics. Here we have some photos of him. He was reportedly a wrestler and a swimmer with them, and they did lots of active things. Here he is, just covered with children. This little boy is John F. Kennedy Jr., but the others are his own children. He was also an outdoorsman. He was an avid outdoorsman, and one of the things that he did after JFK's passing was he went on an expedition in 1965 to summit a mountain that had been named for his brother. He had had no climbing experience, though he was an avid skier, and he was uneasy with heights, but he did climb Mount Kennedy, which was 14,000 feet tall. That is no small mountain. When the peak was near, Whitaker let RFK be the first to reach it. He actually plunged into a crevasse during the climb. Sounds amazing. They clambered up, and as the peak was near, Whitaker let RFK be the first to reach it. Once there, Bobby made the sign of the cross, left memorabilia of JFK's life, and took in the view. Mission accomplished. He later confided to a reporter that he hoped never to climb another mountain and that he hadn't enjoyed the journey. Oh, well, his wife Ethel was quite the force. She actually passed away, I believe, in November of 2024. And she was the mother of the clan, also very vibrant person, very spunky in a lot of ways. And she definitely wrapped her life around Robert F. Kennedy. We are given some photos of RFK during his campaign for the presidency and perhaps some for the Senate as well. This is him sleeping in the aisle on an airplane because of the pace of the campaign. Just a funny photo there, I thought. After he had won the California primary, this is the night that he would be assassinated. The title of the article is Triumph and Tragedy. After an exhausting week of full tilt campaigning and a victory in the California primary, Robert F. Kennedy was slain by an assassin. I do want to point out that we actually have done the entire Life magazine about this one event. So if you are specifically interested in the assassination details, that would be a great episode to go back and watch because it goes into much more detail than we're going to get here in this one article. But I will focus in on the moments of the assassination. He left the lectern and was headed to the press room. But RFK decided to go behind the speaker's platform towards a serving kitchen that led to the press room. The senator walked amid a clutch of aides, hotel employees, and newsmen. The route took him into a hot, malodorous, corridor-like chamber that was to be his place of execution. At the far end of the kitchen stood a young man with a concealed gun. Later, a witness was to say that he had been there for some time, asking if Senator Kennedy would come that way. It was no trick getting in. There were no serious security screenings by either the hotel or the Kennedy staff. This was the event that brought Secret Service protection to candidates. We did not used to do that. We only would protect once they became their party's nominee. But this event was what brought it to the forefront that even candidates were at risk. Here is that photo of the slain Robert F. Kennedy. The gunman managed to get across the room, prop his right elbow on the serving counter, and fire at his victim from a short distance away. Kennedy fell. The hotel men grappled with the shooter but could not reach his gun hand. The gun, being waved wildly, kept firing bullets, hitting 5 other human targets, all of whom survived. 8 men in all, including longtime RFK friends Rafer Johnson, an Olympic champion, and Roosevelt Greer, a 300-pound Los Angeles Rams football player, fought with the slight but lithe assailant, and one of them knocked the pistol out of his hand. Here we have some of the photographs from life where Ethel in the dress and Jean Kennedy was also there that day. Ethel Kennedy knelt over her husband, whispering. His lips moved as he drifted in and out of consciousness. She rose and tried to wave back the crush of people. Romero placed a rosary in his hand, but when a priest appeared, offering to help, someone cried, "He doesn't need a priest, for God's sake. He needs a doctor." A hatless young policeman rushed in with a shotgun. "We don't need guns. We need a doctor." Someone clamped an ice pack to Kennedy's bleeding head. Someone else made a pillow out of a suit jacket. At one point, he is thought to have said, "Is everybody else all right?" As Times' Hayes Gorey wrote, gazing up from the floor, Robert Kennedy, still lucid, wore a haunting expression that no one who knew him will ever forget, fully aware of what had happened. Within a few moments, physicians were found. With Ethel Kennedy by his side, Kennedy was taken first to a nearby receiving hospital where doctors kept him alive by cardiac massage and an injection of adrenaline. They alerted the better-equipped Good Samaritan Hospital to prepare for delicate brain surgery. Kennedy had been hit 3 times. One bullet had just grazed him. Another of the .22 caliber slugs had entered his right armpit and worked its way up to his neck. It was relatively harmless. The third had penetrated his skull and passed into his brain, scattering fragments of lead and bone. It was these that the surgeons had to probe for in their 3-hour, 40-minute operation. In the ICU, after the operation, Ethel rested on a cot, held his unfeeling hand, whispered in his now deaf ear. Sisters Jean and Pat hovered nearby. Ted Kennedy strode back and forth. His older brother lingered in a deep coma. Kennedy's assassin, Sirhan Bishara Sirhan, 24, was a Palestinian whose parents had come to America from Jordan. He claimed to be inflamed to the point of murder by Kennedy's strong support of the State of Israel. Others suspect he was a type all too familiar to Americans, 50 years later, a mentally disturbed person seeking some sort of validation by murdering a famous individual. Sirhan was convicted of RFK's murder in April 1969 and sentenced to death. The term was later commuted to life in prison. As of spring 2018, Sirhan, 73, was incarcerated in a California state penitentiary. "I can explain," he has said, but no explanation could compensate for his crime. There was a memorable train journey of RFK's body where Americans saluted, waved, and celebrated this man who had served their nation and, of course, mourned his own brother. And so it brought about additional grief. Ted Kennedy offered a eulogy at Bobby's funeral. I have to tell you, we read a whole book about Ted Kennedy. And what we are told is that he did not craft this speech at all, that he told his speechwriters, would you write my speech for me? Make it something about love. And his speechwriters were appalled because they thought something this personal should not be written by others. And they were completely right. Like, this book is making this moment by Ted seem more honorable than it was. But by all accounts, Ted was a man who did not craft his own thoughts and was not the honorable senator that we were later given the picture of him to be. Here we have Ted stepping in a similar way that RFK had done for Jackie. Ted stood in beside Ethel. She reportedly hoped that Ted would be a great example to her boys. Well, Robert F. Kennedy was a complex, multifaceted human being. There are reminiscences from people who knew him best. Management in JFK's mind, we're told by a diplomat, consisted largely of calling Bob on the phone and saying, here are 10 things I want to get done. Yeah, RFK was sort of JFK's fixer, wasn't he? We're given one quote by Michael Novak, a journalist and diplomat. I particularly remember his ability to relate to the steelworkers and gas station attendants and barbers and other neighborhood people of the big cities, both black and white. He was the last politician who could unite urban neighborhoods across lines of race and ethnicity. His statement to the crowds the night that Martin Luther King Jr. died was said to have quelled many of the angry and violent reactions that some in the community were having about Martin Luther King's death. I mean, naturally they would feel that, just this rising up of, I can't believe that our leader has been slaughtered like this, but that RFK's grief and expression of empathy and awareness, his sobriety in the moments after Martin Luther King's assassination, was part of what quelled the natural anger and rage that people felt after MLK's assassination. And so it's interesting the way that we think about these three assassinations, and they actually are linked, and that Bobby Kennedy was an integral part of each of the lives of JFK and MLK, and also a key player in the moments after the assassinations of processing through the legal and governmental response to JFK's assassination, as well as the family and the grief response to JFK's assassination. And then in his expression of grief, he became part of MLK's assassination and the process that followed that. The final quote that we have here is this one. The world demands the qualities of youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a temper of the will, a quality of the imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for adventure over the love of ease. This was the image on the cover of the final Time magazine about Robert F. Kennedy, and it's the last one we get here in this book as well. So there we have it, a look at Robert F. Kennedy, the younger brother, the attorney general, the senator, the presidential candidate, and ultimately the man that was fallen by an assassin's bullet. There's more to discuss for sure. I have an article actually about Sirhan that I would love to read with you guys sometimes. But for this, the look at his life and his legacy and the end of his life, I'd love to know what was new to you, what was a good refresher, and what do you think actually happened? If you have studied more about it, you know that Sirhan was not close enough and he was not at the right position to have actually fired the fatal bullet. His own son, RFK Jr., does not believe that Sirhan fired the fatal bullet. And as reported here, Sirhan's finger kept firing randomly even after RFK had been struck and had fallen. So there's something else going on with Sirhan, and there is some other explanation for that fatal bullet. So there are definitely unanswered questions about his assassination. And my expectation in the documents is that we will see some of that there will be some sort of internal investigation that happened, that there may be leads that the government had that were not publicly shared, and that similar actually to Lee Harvey Oswald, that the public was led to believe one particular assassin was responsible when perhaps the government had awareness that there was actually more complexity involved in the circumstances. Let me know what you expect from the assassination files that will be released about RFK, and let me know what you thought of this look at the time special edition about Robert F. Kennedy. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Have a great day.